Richard Hartley adjusted the collar of his tailored suit as he stepped out of his towering office building. The city sprawled out before him, alive with the hum of cars, pedestrians, and the distant blaring of sirens. It was a typical day for the millionaire, a string of meetings, calls, and deals, all blending into the background of his busy life. To the outside world, Richard was a man who had it all. His name was synonymous with success. The media often hailed him as a self-made tycoon, someone who had risen from modest beginnings to dominate the world of finance. Yet, as he stood on the bustling sidewalk, he felt none of the satisfaction that such accomplishments were supposed to bring. The autumn air was crisp, and a gust of wind blew a cluster of leaves across the street. Richard pulled his coat tighter around himself, his thoughts wandering as they often did these days. He hadn't always been this way, lost in his own mind, weighed down by something he couldn't quite define. As he walked down the familiar path toward his car, his eyes were drawn to something out of place, a figure sitting on the corner of the street just out of the main flow of pedestrians. A young woman sat huddled on the sidewalk, wrapped in a thin, tattered coat that barely provided any protection from the cold. Her hair was unkempt, tangled in knots, and her face was pale, the hollow cheeks hinting at hunger. In front of her, a cardboard sign lay propped up against her knees, the words crudely written in black marker, "Hungry and homeless. Anything helps." Richard's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than he intended. It wasn't unusual to see beggars in the city, but something about this woman tugged at him in a way he didn't expect. He walked past her, his polished shoes tapping against the pavement, but after a few steps he stopped. There was a flicker of recognition, though he couldn't place it. Her eyes, despite their tiredness, had caught his attention. They were a deep shade of green, vivid against her otherwise worn appearance, and for some reason they stirred something deep within him. A memory? A feeling? He wasn't sure, but it gnawed at him, making it impossible to ignore. Turning back, he approached her slowly, reaching into his wallet as he did so. Without a word, he pulled out a $500 bill and extended it toward her. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. She stared at the money for a moment, clearly unsure if she should take it. People didn't usually give that much, not to someone like her. But eventually her thin fingers reached up, taking the bill from his hand with a shaky grip. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the noise of the street. Richard nodded, barely acknowledging her words. He didn't want to engage in conversation. It was easier to move on, to keep his distance. But as he turned to leave, he caught a final glimpse of her, still clutching the money, her eyes following him as if she, too, sensed something strange in their brief encounter. He shook off the uneasy feeling, dismissing it as nothing more than a fleeting moment of empathy. Later that night, Richard sat in his penthouse apartment, surrounded by luxury, yet feeling oddly restless. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid as he stared out over the city skyline. It should have been a moment of relaxation, a chance to unwind after a long day, but his mind kept returning to the beggar on the street. Why had she affected him so much? There had been hundreds of others like her in the past, people to whom he had given money without a second thought. But this woman, there was something different about her, something that made it impossible for him to forget her face. He tried to dismiss the feeling, but it clung to him like a shadow. He found himself replaying the moment over and over, remembering the way her eyes had met his, the unspoken connection that seemed to pass between them. It was irrational, he told himself. He had no reason to be thinking about her. Yet the more he tried to push the thought away, the more it haunted him. The following day, the unease from the night before had only grown stronger. Richard woke with a sense of anticipation, though he didn't quite know what for. He dressed for the day, going through the motions of his usual routine, but his mind wasn't focused on the meetings and appointments that awaited him. By the time he left his office in the late afternoon, he was practically driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand. He needed to return to the place where he had seen her. As he walked down the same street where their paths had crossed the day before, his eyes scanned the crowd, searching for her familiar figure. But she was nowhere to be found. Richard's steps slowed as he reached the spot where she had been sitting, the absence of her presence nagging at him like an unresolved question. She was gone, as though she had never been there at all. He stood there for a moment, unsure of why he even cared. She was just a stranger, a fleeting part of his day. Yet there was something about her that had unsettled him. A nagging voice in the back of his mind kept telling him there was more to this than coincidence. The green eyes, the sense of familiarity. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen her somewhere before, but he couldn't place when or where. He wandered aimlessly for a while, the city's noise fading into the background as his thoughts took over. Eventually, his feet carried him in an unexpected direction, toward a place he hadn't visited in years. His heart thudded with a strange combination of dread and longing as he realized where he was headed. Evergreen Cemetery. It had been 25 years since Richard had last visited that place, and for good reason. The cemetery held memories he had tried desperately to bury. Memories of a woman he had once loved with all his heart, but had lost in the most devastating way. Isabel Lane. Her name still resonated in his mind, even after all these years. He had loved her deeply, more than anyone else in his life, but their relationship had been shrouded in secrecy. She had disappeared abruptly, leaving him with nothing but questions and heartache. And then, a year after she vanished, Richard had discovered the worst. Her grave, cold and unyielding, had answered the question of where she had gone. The gate to the cemetery creaked as Richard pushed it open. The trees that lined the paths had grown taller since he had last been there, their branches casting long shadows across the ground. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. His steps slowed as he approached the familiar plot, where Isabel's grave lay beneath a modest headstone, the letters of her name etched into the stone as clearly as if it had been carved yesterday. His breath caught in his throat as he neared the grave. It had been so long, but the pain of losing her still felt fresh, as if it had only happened yesterday. He knelt down, brushing away some fallen leaves that had gathered on the ground, and placed a bouquet of fresh white roses on her grave, her favorite. A gesture he had made countless times before, and yet, each time, it felt inadequate. But something was different this time. As Richard stood in silent contemplation, he sensed movement nearby. His eyes darted to the side, and there, just a few feet away, stood the woman, the beggar from the day before. She was standing near Isabel's grave, her head bowed as if in mourning, her posture tense with emotion. For a moment, Richard couldn't move. His mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. Why was she here? How did she know this place? His heart pounded as he took a step closer, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. There was no reason for this woman to be here, no reason at all. And yet here she was, standing at the grave of the woman he had loved and lost decades ago. Richard's breath came in shallow bursts as he stared at the beggar standing by Isabel's grave, his mind spun with confusion and disbelief. The woman before him, ragged and destitute, should not be there, not by that grave, not at that sacred place. His hands tightened into fists by his side, the weight of 25 years of unanswered questions suddenly pressing down on him. Every nerve in his body screamed that something wasn't right, that this encounter was more than just coincidence. But why was she there? And why was she looking down at the grave of the woman he had loved, as though it meant something to her? The cemetery, once a quiet place of reflection, seemed to pulse with a strange energy. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches casting eerie shadows over the gravestones, but Richard hardly noticed. His eyes were fixed on the woman. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her gaze was locked on the headstone, her shoulders hunched, as if under a heavy burden, though whether it was the cold or something deeper, Richard couldn't tell. Finally, Richard's patience broke, and with a sudden burst of movement, he stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel pathway beneath him. "What are you doing here?" The words tumbled out, harsher than he intended, the shock and confusion layering his voice with an edge of suspicion. The woman flinched, startled out of her reverie. Her body stiffened, and she slowly turned to face him. There was a moment of silence as their eyes met. The same deep green eyes that had disturbed Richard the day before now seemed to bore into him, but there was something different in her expression. A depth of sadness, maybe, or an understanding that he couldn't place. It unnerved him. She hesitated before speaking, her voice soft, almost a whisper. I didn't mean to intrude." Her words trembled, and she looked down, as if she were ashamed to be caught there. Richard's confusion turned to frustration. "How do you know this place? What are you doing by her grave?" He wasn't sure why it mattered, but it did. Isabel's grave had always been a private matter, something personal and intimate. The thought of this stranger standing there, lingering over it like she had any connection to his past, set him on edge. For a long moment, the woman said nothing, her gaze dropping back to the headstone. Then slowly, she whispered words that struck Richard to his core. "She was my mother." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Richard blinked, certain he hadn't heard her correctly. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, controlled, but beneath it was a storm of disbelief and rising dread. He had come here expecting the same quiet solitude he always found at Isabel's grave, but this was something far beyond anything he could have imagined. The woman took a step back, her arms folding tightly across her chest, as though she were trying to shield herself from his reaction. "Isabel Lane," she repeated softly. "She was my mother." Richard's knees weakened, and for a brief moment he thought he might collapse. Isabel had been pregnant when she disappeared, but she had never told him. In all the years since her death, he had wondered if she had carried his child, but no one had ever confirmed it. And now, standing before him, was a woman claiming to be that child. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the past. Could it be possible? Could this beggar, this homeless woman, be his daughter? How? He couldn't seem to form the question fully, his throat tight with emotion. His thoughts were tangled, overlapping one another as they fought to make sense of what she had said. How could you be Isabel's daughter? She never told me. She never said anything. The woman, his daughter, if what she said was true, gave a bitter smile, though it was more sorrow than anger. She didn't have the chance, did she? Her voice was raw, filled with years of hurt. She died before she could tell anyone the truth. Richard's breath hitched as her words sank in. She was right. Isabel had been gone for 25 years, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. Richard had never known the details of her last days. He hadn't known that she had given birth to a daughter, that she had left behind a piece of herself in this world. And now, after all this time, that daughter stood before him, a stranger, yet someone who should have been family. "What's your name?" Richard's voice was rough, his throat tight with the weight of the moment. The woman hesitated, her green eyes searching his face for something. Perhaps recognition, perhaps understanding. "Emma," she said quietly. "Emma Lane." The name felt like a knife twisting in Richard's gut. Lane. Isabel had never taken his name, and now neither had her daughter. There was an odd finality in that realization. This woman, this Emma, had lived her entire life apart from him, completely unaware of who he was. He was nothing to her. And yet, in that moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just changed. "I never knew," Richard muttered, more to himself than to her. "I never knew about you." His voice was thick with regret. He could barely meet Emma's eyes, the weight of guilt pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. If he had known, if Isabel had told him, he could have done something. He could have helped. Maybe things would have been different. Maybe Emma wouldn't be standing before him in rags, her life broken by circumstances beyond her control. Emma's expression hardened. "No, you didn't know, and I didn't know about you. My whole life I didn't know who you were." Richard's chest tightened at her words. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he say? That he hadn't been there for her because he didn't know? That he would have cared for her if he had known the truth? They felt like empty excuses even to him. The truth was he hadn't been there, neither for her nor for Isabel. He had failed them both. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. Emma's eyes flashed with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Sorry? That doesn't change anything, does it? My mother's dead and I've been alone for as long as I can remember." Her voice trembled with emotion, and Richard could hear the years of pain behind it. "I didn't abandon you," Richard said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know you existed. If I had—" "If you had," Emma interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "What would you have done? Would you have taken me in? Would you have cared for me like a real father? Or would you have let me live on the streets like I have for years?" Her voice was sharp now, cutting through the silence of the cemetery. Richard flinched at the harshness of her words, but he couldn't blame her for feeling this way. She had every right to be angry. He had failed her in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The realization was like a punch to the gut. This woman, this daughter he hadn't known about, had lived a life of hardship because of secrets kept from him, because of choices made by others. But now, standing before her, he couldn't change the past. He could only face the reality of the present and hope to find a way forward. "I would have taken care of you," Richard said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "I would have made sure you had everything you needed. I would have loved you." Emma's expression softened, but only slightly. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, she let out a weary sigh and glanced back at the grave. "It's too late for that now," she muttered, her voice hollow. "Too much time has passed." Richard stepped closer, his heart aching. "It's never too late, Emma. We can still—" But before he could finish, Emma turned away, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of the conversation was too much to bear. "I don't need anything from you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not anymore." Richard watched as she walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the cemetery. His heart felt heavy, burdened by the realization that he had just found a daughter he might never truly know. He stood there for a long time, staring after her, unsure of what to do next. All he knew was that his world had changed in an instant, and he couldn't go back to the way things were. Richard returned home that night in a daze, his mind still reeling from the encounter at the cemetery. The revelation that he had a daughter he had never known about, was overwhelming, and the weight of it pressed down on him with every step he took. His luxurious penthouse, usually a symbol of his success and power, now felt cold and hollow. He wandered aimlessly through the expansive rooms, barely registering the opulence that surrounded him. The sleek furniture, the polished marble floors, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, none of it mattered anymore. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but even the burn of the liquor as it slid down his throat did little to calm the storm raging inside him. Isabel had been pregnant. All these years the question had haunted him, but he had never allowed himself to dwell on it for too long. After she disappeared, there were no signs, no hints that she had carried his child. Her family had cut off all contact with him, and when he finally found her grave, he had been left with nothing but grief and unanswered questions. He had mourned her deeply, but he had never known the full extent of what he had lost. Now the truth had been laid bare before him. Isabel had given birth to a daughter, Emma, and she had kept that child hidden from him. Richard couldn't wrap his mind around it. Why hadn't Isabel told him? What had kept her from reaching out, from letting him know that he was going to be a father? A father. The word felt foreign in his mind, and yet it was now inescapable. His thoughts raced, circling back to the moment in the cemetery when Emma had told him she was Isabel's daughter. She had been so cold, so guarded, as though she had long since built walls around her heart. Richard couldn't blame her for that. If she had grown up without him, without knowing who he was, it made sense that she would be angry, distrustful. But it still stung, seeing his own daughter, a stranger, standing before him, filled with bitterness and resentment. The guilt gnawed at him. He should have been there for her. He should have known. But how could he have? He had been kept in the dark, left to mourn a woman he loved without ever knowing the full truth. And now his daughter had lived a life of hardship, a life on the streets, while he had thrived in wealth and comfort. The contrast between their lives was staggering, and it left him feeling sick with shame. Unable to sit still any longer, Richard grabbed his phone and dialed the number of his private investigator, a man he had trusted with delicate matters in the past. His fingers trembled slightly as he waited for the call to connect, his heart pounding in his chest. The investigator answered on the second ring, his voice professional and to the point. "I need you to look into something for me," Richard said, his voice rough with urgency. "It's personal." "Of course, Mr. Hartley. What can I do for you?" the investigator asked, sensing the gravity in Richard's tone. "I want you to find out everything you can about a woman named Emma Lane," Richard continued. "She's the daughter of Isabel Lane. I need to know where she's been, what happened to her after Isabel died." There was a pause on the other end of the line as the investigator jotted down notes. "I'll get started right away. It might take some time to gather all the details, but I'll let you know as soon as I have something." Richard thanked him and hung up, pacing the length of his living room. Time. That was something he felt he didn't have much of. How many years had been wasted, years in which he could have been a father to Emma, years in which he could have helped her, supported her, given her the life she deserved? The thought of all those lost moments, of the childhood he had missed, filled him with a sense of desperation. He didn't want to waste any more time. He had to know the truth, and he had to find a way to fix things, no matter how impossible it seemed. Days passed, and each one felt like an eternity. Richard threw himself into his work, trying to distract himself from the gnawing sense of guilt and regret that consumed him. But no matter how many meetings he attended, no matter how many deals he closed, his thoughts always returned to Emma. Where was she? What was she doing? Was she still living on the streets, struggling to survive? The image of her standing in front of Isabel's grave haunted him. Her thin frame, her tired eyes, her air of quiet resignation. She had looked like someone who had given up, someone who had stopped hoping for a better life. One evening, the phone call Richard had been waiting for finally came. The investigator's voice was brisk, but there was an undercurrent of seriousness that immediately caught Richard's attention. "I've found out some things about Emma Lane," the investigator said. "It took some digging, but I've pieced together a timeline of her life after Isabel's death." Richard sat down, bracing himself for what he was about to hear. "Go on." After Isabel passed away, Emma was placed in the foster care system. She was only a baby at the time, and from what I've gathered, there were no relatives who stepped forward to take her in. She spent most of her childhood bouncing between different foster homes, never staying in one place for too long. It looks like she had a difficult time. There are records of her running away from several homes, and by the time she was a teenager, she was on the streets. Richard's heart sank as he listened. He had feared the worst, but hearing the confirmation of Emma's struggles was even more painful than he had imagined. She was in and out of shelters for years, the investigator continued. There were times when she tried to get back on her feet. She worked odd jobs, tried to find stable housing, but it seems like things never quite worked out for her. She's been homeless for the better part of the last decade. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the words. His daughter had spent years on the streets while he had lived in luxury. The disparity between their lives was unbearable. He had failed her, even if he hadn't known it at the time. "Is there anything else?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. The investigator hesitated for a moment before responding. "There's one more thing. It seems that Emma didn't find out about you until a few years ago. She came across some old letters that Isabel had written but never sent. In those letters, Isabel mentioned you. She wrote about the time she spent with you, about her love for you, and about the pregnancy." Richard's chest tightened at the mention of the letters. Isabel had written to him? Letters that had never reached him? It was almost too much to bear. "The letters were never sent," the investigator continued. "But Emma found them after Isabel's death. That's how she found out about you." Richard's heart ached with the realization. Emma had discovered his existence through letters that were never meant to be hidden. She had grown up believing she had no family, only to learn the truth years later, when it was too late for either of them to do anything about it. After the call ended, Richard sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything he had learned pressing down on him like a physical force. He had never felt more helpless in his life. He had spent years building an empire, amassing wealth and power, But none of it mattered now. All the money in the world couldn't undo the damage that had been done. He couldn't give Emma back the childhood she had lost. He couldn't erase the years of pain and hardship she had endured. But there was one thing he could do. He could try to make things right. He didn't know how yet, but he was determined to find a way to help Emma to be the father he should have been from the beginning. Even if she never forgave him, even if she never accepted him into her life, he had to try. A few days later, Richard went back to the streets where he had first seen Emma. He searched for her, wandering through the areas where homeless people often gathered, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. Hours passed, and still there was no sign of her. Frustration gnawed at him, but he refused to give up. He would find her. He had to. Eventually, as the evening light began to fade, Richard spotted her. Emma was sitting on a bench near the cemetery, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. She looked tired, her clothes ragged, her face gaunt. But there was something else in her expression, something that had shifted since the last time he saw her. A quiet resignation, perhaps, or maybe just the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting for too long. Richard approached her slowly, unsure of how to start the conversation. Emma looked up as he neared, her eyes flickering with recognition, but she didn't speak. She simply watched him, waiting. "I've been looking for you," Richard said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Emma's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" she asked, her tone flat. Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because I want to help you. I didn't know, I never knew about you. But now that I do, I want to make things right." Emma let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Make things right? How? You can't just show up after all these years and expect everything to be okay." "I know," Richard said quietly, his throat tight with emotion. "I know I can't change the past. I can't undo what's been done. But I can help you now. I want to help you now." Emma stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she shook her head again, her voice filled with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "I don't need your help. I've been doing this on my own for years. I'm not some charity case." "You're not a charity case," Richard said, his voice firm but gentle. "You're my daughter." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Emma looked away, her eyes flickering with something Richard couldn't quite decipher. Pain, anger, maybe even a flicker of hope. "I don't know you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't just show up and act like we're some happy family. It doesn't work like that." "I know," Richard said again, his heart aching. "But I want to get to know you. I want to be there for you, if you'll let me." Emma didn't respond immediately. She sat in silence for a long time, her eyes focused on the ground in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, less guarded. "I don't know if I can do that." Richard's chest tightened, but he nodded. "Take your time," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. And for Richard, that was enough for now. The days following Richard's conversation with Emma were filled with uncertainty. He had left her sitting on that cold bench near the cemetery, her face a mixture of emotions that he couldn't fully read. He had given her space, knowing she needed time to process everything. Richard himself was grappling with his own whirlwind of emotions, guilt, regret, and the dawning realization that the life he had been living was incomplete without her in it. He had spent so many years building an empire, focusing on success, but now all of that felt hollow in comparison to what truly mattered, the daughter he had never known. The truth gnawed at him every moment of the day. Isabel had died without telling him about their child, leaving Emma to fend for herself in a world that had been unkind to her. The more Richard thought about it, the more the weight of his unintentional neglect threatened to overwhelm him. He knew he couldn't go back in time, couldn't fix the years Emma had spent alone, but he was determined to change her future, if she would let him. Richard continued to frequent the areas where he knew Emma might be, hoping for another encounter. He didn't want to push her, didn't want to force himself into her life before she was ready, but he couldn't sit idly by either. His world, once filled with business meetings, luxury trips, and endless dinners with wealthy acquaintances, suddenly felt devoid of meaning. He found himself distracted during work, unable to focus on the deals and negotiations that had once consumed him. His mind was always on Emma, on the years they had lost, and on the slim possibility of reconnecting with her. One evening, about a week after their last conversation, Richard decided to visit Evergreen Cemetery once again. It had always been a place of reflection for him, a place where he could feel close to Isabel. But now it had become something more, a place where he had met his daughter, where his life had changed forever. He needed to go back, to stand by Isabel's grave and try to make sense of everything that had happened. Maybe in some small way, being there would help him find clarity. The cemetery was quiet that evening, the sun setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the gravestones. Richard walked slowly through the winding paths, his footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness. As he approached Isabel's grave, he felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the grief that had never fully left him. But this time, it was mixed with something new, hope, fragile as it was. When he reached the grave, he was surprised to see someone already there. Emma. She was standing by the headstone, her back to him, her posture rigid and tense. Richard's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to see her here again, not so soon. He took a few cautious steps forward, unsure if she had noticed him yet. The last thing he wanted was to intrude on her moment of reflection. "Emma," he said softly, his voice barely louder than a whisper. She turned slightly, glancing over her shoulder at him. Her expression was guarded, but she didn't seem surprised to see him. In fact, it was almost as if she had been waiting for him, though she would never admit it. She turned back toward the gravestone, her gaze lingering on her mother's name, etched into the stone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Richard stood a few feet away from her, unsure of what to say, unsure if she even wanted him there. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, unspoken pain. "I didn't think you'd come here again," Emma finally said, her voice quiet but steady. Richard took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the headstone. "I come here often," he admitted, "to remember her, to try and make peace with the past." Emma nodded slightly, though she didn't look at him. "I've been coming here too, after I found out about you. I didn't know where else to go." Richard's heart ached at the thought of her, alone, visiting her mother's grave, with no one to guide her, no one to help her understand what had happened all those years ago. He took another step closer, his voice filled with regret. "I wish I had known. I wish things could have been different." Emma remained silent for a moment, her gaze still focused on the headstone. Then she let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight of the world had finally become too much to bear. "It's not your fault," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of resignation and sadness. "You didn't know. And even if you had, I don't know if it would have changed anything." Richard's chest tightened. "I would have been there for you," he said softly. "I would have done everything I could to give you a better life." Emma finally turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for something, maybe sincerity, maybe understanding. Her expression softened, but there was still a hint of wariness in her gaze. "I don't know if I believe that," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I've spent my whole life thinking no one cared. It's hard to suddenly believe that someone does." Richard felt a pang of guilt at her words, but he didn't let it deter him. He had to prove to her that he meant what he said, that he truly wanted to be there for her. "I care, Emma. I care more than you know, and I'm not going to walk away from you. Not now, not ever." Emma looked down at the ground, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her sleeve. She didn't respond immediately, and Richard could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. He knew this wasn't easy for her, that she had built walls around herself to protect against the pain she had endured for so long. But he also knew that if he could just reach her, if he could show her that he wasn't like the others who had abandoned her, they might have a chance. "I don't know how to do this," Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to let someone in after everything I've been through." Richard took a step closer, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to do it all at once. We can take it one step at a time. I'm not expecting you to trust me right away. I know I have to earn that." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Why are you doing this? Why do you care so much?" Richard's heart ached at the question, but he understood why she asked it. After everything she had been through, after all the people who had let her down, it was only natural for her to question his motives. He took a deep breath before answering, his voice filled with emotion. "Because you're my daughter, Emma, and I've spent too many years without you in my life. I don't want to lose any more time." Emma's expression softened, and for the first time, Richard saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Something that wasn't pain or anger, but a glimmer of hope. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And that was enough for him. They stood in silence for a while longer, the tension between them slowly beginning to ease. The air was still, the sun now dipping below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the cemetery. Richard felt a sense of calm settle over him, a feeling that he hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. After a while, Emma let out a soft sigh and glanced up at the sky, her face bathed in the fading light. "I don't know what comes next," she said quietly. "But I'm willing to try, if you are." Richard's heart swelled with emotion, and he nodded, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm here, Emma, for whatever you need. We'll figure it out together." Emma gave him a small, tentative smile, the first one he had seen from her since they had met. It was a start, and that was all Richard needed. They didn't need to have all the answers right now, they just needed to take things one day at a time, to rebuild the relationship that had been stolen from them. In the days that followed, Richard and Emma began to meet more frequently. It wasn't easy. There were moments of awkwardness, moments when Emma pulled away, unsure of how to let herself be vulnerable. but Richard was patient. He didn't push her, didn't demand more than she was ready to give. He knew that trust was something that had to be earned, and he was willing to put in the time and effort to earn it. They started by meeting at the cemetery, a place that had once been filled with pain and loss, but was now slowly becoming a place of healing. They would talk about Isabel, about the life Richard had shared with her, about the memories that still haunted him. Emma listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just quietly absorbing the stories. It was clear that she had longed to know more about her mother, to fill in the gaps of the life she had never been a part of. Gradually, their conversations began to shift. They talked about Emma's childhood, the foster homes she had lived in, the struggles she had faced. Richard listened with a heavy heart, each story another reminder of the life he hadn't been there for. But he didn't shy away from it. He wanted to know everything, no matter how painful it was, because it was a part of who Emma was. And if he was going to be in her life now, he needed to understand where she had come from. As the weeks passed, something began to shift between them. The walls Emma had built around herself started to come down, piece by piece. She began to open up more, to let Richard see the vulnerable side of her that she had spent so long hiding. And in return, Richard shared more of himself, his regrets, his hopes, and his desire to make up for the lost time. It wasn't a perfect process. There were setbacks, moments when old wounds reopened and emotions ran high, but Richard never wavered. He had made a promise to himself and to Emma that he would be there for her no matter what. And he intended to keep that promise. In the months that followed, the fragile relationship between Richard and Emma began to take shape, though not without its challenges. Richard had always been a man accustomed to control. He was used to making decisions, leading projects, and seeing his plans unfold exactly as he intended. But with Emma, things were different. The dynamic between them was delicate, and Richard quickly learned that rebuilding a relationship after years of absence required more patience and care than anything he had ever experienced in the business world. Emma, for her part, was still guarded. While she had started to let Richard into her life, there was an ever-present wariness in her eyes, a lingering distrust that came from years of disappointment and abandonment. Richard couldn't blame her. He was, after all, a stranger to her, and even though they shared blood, their lives had been worlds apart. He knew that his wealth, his comfort, and his privilege were alien to her, and he was careful never to flaunt it or push it in her face. He wanted Emma to feel seen, not pitied. They continued to meet regularly, sometimes in public places, sometimes at Richard's estate, where he had set up a private room for her, should she ever choose to stay. Emma rarely accepted the offer, preferring to keep their encounters brief and on neutral ground. But there were moments, however fleeting, when Richard caught glimpses of the daughter he longed to know, the woman beneath the armor she had constructed to survive. Those moments gave him hope, even when the progress felt agonizingly slow. One evening, as they sat together in the garden of Richard's estate, the conversation turned to Emma's future. They had been talking about her past for weeks, about the years she had spent in foster care, about the jobs she had taken to scrape by, about the nights she had spent on the streets. But tonight was different. For the first time, Emma seemed willing to discuss what came next. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," Emma admitted, her voice soft but thoughtful. She was sitting on a stone bench, the twilight casting a soft glow over her face. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers absent-mindedly twisting a loose thread on her sweater. "I've spent so long just trying to survive, I never really thought about what would happen after." Richard watched her carefully, not wanting to push her too hard. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said gently. "But I think it's important that you start thinking about what you want, not just what you need to get by." Emma let out a small, humorless laugh. "What I want?" she repeated, as if the concept were foreign to her. "I don't even know what that is anymore." Richard felt a pang of sadness at her words. The idea that his daughter had spent her entire life focused solely on survival without the luxury of dreams or ambitions broke his heart. He wanted to help her, to give her the opportunity to explore her passions, to find a purpose beyond the struggle. But he knew he had to tread carefully. Emma had always been fiercely independent, and any attempt to fix her life too quickly might drive her away. "Maybe it's time to start finding out," Richard suggested. "You have time now, there's no rush, no pressure, just think about what makes you happy." Emma was silent for a long time, her eyes focused on the garden path in front of her. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and a light breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. It was a peaceful scene, but Richard could sense the turmoil just beneath the surface of Emma's calm exterior. "I've never really thought about happiness," Emma said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "It always seemed like something other people had, something that was out of reach for me." Richard's heart ached at her confession, but he didn't interrupt. He could tell she was working through her thoughts, trying to make sense of her life in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. "I guess, if I could do anything," Emma continued, her voice hesitant, "I'd want to help people. People like me. People who've been through what I've been through." Richard felt a surge of pride at her words. Even after everything she had endured, Emma's heart was still filled with compassion, still focused on others. It was a rare and beautiful quality, and it only made him admire her more. "That's a noble goal," Richard said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "And I think you'd be incredible at it." Emma looked up at him, her green eyes filled with uncertainty. "But how?" she asked. "How do I even start? I don't have any qualifications, any education. I barely made it through high school." Richard leaned forward, his expression serious but encouraging. "That doesn't matter, Emma. You're smart and you're capable. If helping people is what you want to do, there are ways to make it happen. You could go back to school or you could start volunteering. You don't have to have a degree to make a difference." Emma looked thoughtful, her brow furrowing as she considered his words. "I don't know," she murmured. "I don't know if I'm ready for all that." "There's no rush," Richard said again, his tone patient and supportive. "You've been through a lot, and it's okay to take things one step at a time. But just know that whatever you decide, I'm here to help you. I'll support you in any way I can." Emma glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked, her voice tinged with a hint of suspicion. Richard smiled gently. "Because you're my daughter, Emma, and I care about you. I always have, even when I didn't know you existed." Emma looked away, her fingers still twisting the thread on her sweater. She didn't respond immediately, but Richard could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his intentions were genuine, but the scars from her past still held her back. After a long silence, she spoke again, her voice quiet but filled with determination. "I'll think about it," she said. about what I want to do, but I need to do it on my own terms." Richard nodded, understanding the importance of her words. "Of course," he agreed. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here whenever you're ready." Emma didn't say anything more, but Richard could see that the walls between them were slowly coming down. It wasn't an easy process, and he knew that it would take time. But for the first time since they had met, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that one day Emma might truly let him into her life. In the weeks that followed, Emma began to take small steps toward building a new future for herself. She enrolled in a few community college courses, testing the waters to see what she might be interested in. It was a tentative start, but Richard could see the spark of curiosity in her eyes as she explored different subjects. She hadn't made any definitive decisions yet, but it was clear that she was starting to believe in the possibility of a better future. Their relationship, while still fragile, began to deepen. Emma visited Richard more often, and though there were still moments of hesitation and awkwardness, the conversations between them became more natural. They talked about everything: her classes, her hopes for the future, even lighter topics like movies and music. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was all Richard had ever wanted. One evening, as they sat together in the garden once again, Emma turned to him, her expression more open than he had ever seen it. "I'm glad we met," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet sincerity. I didn't think I'd ever be able to say that, but I am. I'm glad." Richard's heart swelled with emotion, and he smiled at her, his voice thick with gratitude. "I'm glad too, Emma. More than you know." It was a simple exchange, but in that moment, Richard felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, believing that wealth and power would fill the void left by Isabel's death. But now, as he sat with his daughter, he realized that true fulfillment came from something far more profound: connection, love, and the chance to heal old wounds. As the evening grew darker, Richard and Emma sat in comfortable silence, the warmth of their newfound relationship filling the space between them. The past was still there, lingering in the background, but for the first time it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like something they could acknowledge, something they could carry with them as they moved forward. Richard knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more hurdles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He had found his daughter, and while they couldn't change the past, they had a future to build together. And that, Richard realized, was worth more than all the wealth in the world. In the months that followed, Emma continued to blossom. She threw herself into her studies, discovering a passion for social work that took her by surprise. She began volunteering at a local shelter, helping others who had experienced the same struggles she had once faced. The work was hard, often heartbreaking, but it gave her a sense of purpose that she had never known before. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was making a difference, not just for herself, but for others. Richard, true to his word, supported her every step of the way. He attended her volunteer events, helped her navigate the complexities of her new education, and offered advice when she asked for it. But more than that, he was simply there, for her. He didn't try to control her decisions or push her in any particular direction. He let her lead the way, trusting that she would find her own path. Their relationship, once strained and uncertain, had become something beautiful, something built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. Emma had finally begun to let go of the pain that had defined her for so long. and in doing so, she had allowed herself to open up to the possibility of love. One day, as they stood together by Isabel's grave, Emma turned to Richard, her eyes filled with emotion. "I think Mum would have wanted this," she said softly. "She would have wanted us to find each other." Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I think so too." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind rustling the leaves above them, the sun warm on their faces. It wasn't the end of their journey, but it was a moment of peace, a moment of healing. And as Richard looked at his daughter, he knew that they had finally found what they had both been searching for: each other. The future was still uncertain, but they would face it together. And that, Richard realized, was all that truly mattered.